The Galactic University Station hung in the void like a chrome and glass monument to bureaucratic overreach, spinning lazily between three suns that couldn't quite decide which one was supposed to be providing the dramatic lighting. Lacey Knox had been staring out the observation deck's massive windows for the better part of an hour, watching cargo ships dock with all the grace of drunken elephants, when she heard the sound that would completely derail her Tuesday afternoon, and, frankly, the next several months of her life. It was a whimper, not the pathetic, attention-seeking whimper of her roommate back on Earth when the coffee maker broke, but something raw and desperate that seemed to claw its way up from the station's mechanical bowels. Now, any sensible student would have shrugged, assumed it was just another one of the station's 14,000 daily mechanical failures, and continued pretending to study xenobiology while actually composing mental letters home about how the cafeteria's Terran-style pizza was a war crime against both species involved. But Lacey Knox had never been accused of being sensible, a character flaw that had gotten her kicked out of 2 universities on Earth before she'd somehow convinced the Galactic Exchange Program that she was exactly the sort of diplomatic ambassador humanity needed among the stars. The whimper came again, definitely organic, definitely distressed, and definitely coming from somewhere it shouldn't be. Lacey closed her datapad with the kind of resigned sigh that suggested she already knew she was about to do something monumentally stupid. The sound seemed to be echoing up through one of the maintenance grates near the wall, which made perfect sense because, of course, whatever was making that noise would be in the one place students were absolutely, positively, under penalty of expulsion, forbidden to go. She glanced around the observation deck. A group of Zentorians were engaged in what appeared to be either an intense philosophical debate or a very polite argument about lunch. With their species, it was impossible to tell the difference. 3 Netherian students sat in a perfect triangle, probably conducting some sort of telepathic study group that made Lacey feel like she was interrupting just by existing in the same room. Nobody was paying attention to one human girl contemplating a minor act of rebellion against station regulations. The maintenance grate was the industrial kind, designed by engineers who clearly believed that if something was important enough to protect, it should require either a degree in mechanical engineering or the jaws of life to access. Fortunately, Lacey had spent her childhood systematically breaking into places she wasn't supposed to be, a skill set that had seemed useless until this exact moment. She knelt beside the grate, pulling a multi-tool from her backpack, a device that was technically for educational purposes, but had already proven surprisingly effective at opening things that were supposed to stay closed. The screws came loose with the sort of squeaking protest that suggested they hadn't been disturbed since the station's construction. The whimper came again, closer now, followed by 2 more that harmonized in a way that made Lacey's chest tight. 3 voices, young ones, scared and probably hungry. She lifted the grate and peered into the maintenance shaft. The emergency lighting cast everything in that particular shade of institutional green that made even healthy people look like they were dying slowly. About 3 meters down, huddled against a junction of pipes that radiated warmth, were 3 of the most pathetic creatures Lacey had ever seen. They were clearly Kethrak cubs, though clearly was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Lacey had seen pictures of adult Kethrak in her xenobiology textbooks, magnificent apex predators that looked like someone had crossed a tiger with a velociraptor and then given the result both intelligence and a really bad attitude. These cubs looked like someone had put those same apex predators through a blender of malnutrition and terror. Their fur, which should have been a rich golden brown with distinctive black stripes, was dull and matted. They were thin enough that Lacey could see the outline of their ribs, and they huddled together with the desperate closeness of creatures who had learned that the universe was not a kind place. 6 large, amber eyes stared up at her with a mixture of hope and resignation that made something in Lacey's chest crack. "Oh, hell," she muttered, which was probably not the most diplomatic first contact humanity could have asked for. The cubs didn't move, just continued staring at her with those enormous eyes. One of them, the smallest, with a distinctive white patch on its forehead, made a soft chirping sound that was probably the Kethrak equivalent of, "Please don't hurt us. We're already having a really bad day." Lacey's brain, which had been specifically trained to think through the diplomatic ramifications of interspecies contact, immediately went offline. In its place, every human instinct that had kept the species alive since they'd first started adopting wolves kicked into overdrive. These were babies. They were scared, hungry, and alone. Everything else was just paperwork. She pulled out her lunch, a sandwich that the cafeteria had optimistically labeled Terran Club, but which bore about as much resemblance to Earth food as the station's artificial gravity bore to actual physics. The cub's eyes tracked the movement of her hand with laser focus. "Okay, easy there," she said softly, tearing the sandwich into 3 pieces. "I'm going to lower this down, and you're going to eat it like civilized apex predators, right?" She dropped the first piece. The cub with the white patch caught it before it hit the ground, examined it with the sort of suspicious caution that suggested previous experience with things that seemed too good to be true, then devoured it in 3 quick bites. The other 2 cubs immediately pressed closer, making soft pleading sounds that transcended species barriers. Lacey dropped the remaining pieces, watching as the cubs shared them with a coordination that suggested they'd been looking out for each other for a while. When the food was gone, they looked back up at her with expressions that somehow managed to convey both gratitude and a polite inquiry about whether there might be more where that came from. "Sorry, guys, that's all I've got on me," Lacey said, then immediately felt ridiculous for talking to alien predator cubs like they were lost puppies. "But hang on, let me think about this." She sat back on her heels, studying the situation. The cubs were in the maintenance shaft for a reason, probably because it was warm, hidden, and nobody would think to look for them there, which meant they were either lost, abandoned, or hiding from something. Given that Kethrak were notoriously protective of their young and traveled in family groups, the most likely explanation was that something had happened to their pack. The cubs seemed content to wait while she thought, curled up together again but still watching her with those luminous eyes. The smallest one yawned, revealing teeth that were already impressively sharp, despite its obvious youth. "Right," Lacey said, standing up and dusting off her knees. "I'm going to figure this out. You 3 just stay put, okay? Don't go anywhere." She was halfway to the observation deck's exit when it occurred to her that she was giving instructions to alien predators in English and expecting them to understand her. But when she glanced back, the cubs were exactly where she'd left them, still watching her with what looked remarkably like trust. The station's directory was one of those marvels of galactic bureaucracy that managed to make simple information as difficult to access as possible. After 20 minutes of navigating through menus that seemed designed by sadistic philosophers, Lacey finally found what she was looking for: the contact information for the station's Wildlife Management Division. The Zentorian who answered her call had the sort of voice that suggested he'd rather be doing literally anything else with his day. "Wildlife Management, this is Blixen. What's your complaint?" "I need to report 3 Kethrak cubs that appear to be abandoned," Lacey said, trying to sound official and responsible rather than like a student who'd just committed breaking and entering for the sake of alien baby predators. There was a pause. "Kethrak cubs? On the station?" "Yes, in one of the maintenance shafts near Observation Deck 12. They're malnourished, and appear to have been there for some time. Another pause, longer this time. "Miss, are you certain these are Kethrak cubs? Adult Kethrak don't just abandon their young." "I'm studying xenobiology," Lacey said, which wasn't exactly a lie. "I'm familiar with Kethrak biology and behavior. These cubs are approximately 6 months old based on their size and development, and they're clearly in distress." "6 months," Blixen repeated, and his tone shifted from bored bureaucrat to concerned official. "Miss, I'm going to need you to step away from that area immediately. I'm dispatching a security team to your location." "Wait, why? They're just babies. They're not dangerous." "Miss, with all due respect, you're human. Your species has been part of the galactic community for less than 50 years. Kethrak cubs at 6 months are capable of taking down prey twice their size. For your own safety, please move to a secure location and wait for security to arrive." The call ended with the sort of decisive click that suggested arguing would be both futile and potentially criminal. Lacey stared at her communicator, a growing sense of unease settling in her stomach. She'd called for help, but something about Blixen's tone suggested that help might not be exactly what the cubs needed. She made it back to the observation deck just as the security team arrived. 3 Zentorians in full riot gear approached the maintenance grate with the sort of cautious precision typically reserved for defusing bombs or negotiating with terrorists. Blixen himself brought up the rear, a tall, angular alien whose expression suggested he'd rather be dealing with anything other than lost predator cubs and overly helpful humans. "Miss Knox," he said, consulting a datapad, "please step back from the maintenance access." "They're just hungry," Lacey said, not moving. "They're scared and alone, and they just need—" "What they need," Blixen interrupted, "is to be properly contained and processed according to station safety protocols. Unauthorized wildlife cannot remain on the station." The security team had portable containment fields, the kind used for capturing dangerous specimens. They moved with mechanical efficiency, lowering the fields into the maintenance shaft, while Lacey watched in growing horror. The cubs didn't resist. They pressed together as the containment fields activated, creating crackling barriers of energy around each of them. But they kept looking up at Lacey, those amber eyes wide with confusion and betrayal that cut through her like a physical blow. "Wait," she said, stepping forward. "You don't understand. They trust me." "If you just let me—" "Miss Knox," Blixen's voice carried the sort of official authority that brooked no argument. "Interfering with a security operation is a violation of station regulations. Please step back." They lifted the cubs out one by one, small forms trapped in crackling energy cages that hummed with contained power. The cubs called out as they were separated, not the fierce roars Lacey expected from predators, but high, distressed sounds that were unmistakably the cries of frightened children. The smallest cub, the one with the white patch, stretched one paw toward Lacey as its containment field was carried past. She reached out instinctively, but the energy barrier sparked against her fingers, preventing any contact. "Where are you taking them?" she demanded, following the security team as they headed for the exit. "Standard quarantine protocols," Blixen replied without looking back. "They'll be held pending identification of their legal status and determination of appropriate placement." "Legal status? They're babies. They're potentially dangerous alien wildlife found in an unauthorized location," Blixen corrected. "The paperwork alone will take weeks to process." Lacey watched helplessly as the security team disappeared through the exit, carrying 3 confused, terrified cubs toward whatever fate awaited unaccompanied alien minors in the galactic bureaucracy. The observation deck felt suddenly empty and cold, despite the warm light from the three suns still streaming through the massive windows. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the open maintenance grate and the disturbed dust that was the only remaining evidence that three small lives had been huddled there, waiting for help that had turned into something else entirely. "Well," she said to the empty room, "that could have gone better." But even as she said it, she was already pulling out her communicator and accessing the station directory again. Because if there was one thing humans were known for throughout the galaxy, it was their absolute inability to let sleeping dogs lie, especially when those dogs were actually alien predator cubs who'd just been dragged away by security while making sounds that would haunt her dreams for weeks. Blixen and his security team had no idea what they'd just started, but they were about to find out. The Galactic University Station's bureaucratic labyrinth made Earth's tax code look like a children's picture book. Lacey had been wandering through identical corridors lined with identical offices, staffed by identical functionaries, for the better part of 3 hours, and she was beginning to suspect that the entire administrative wing had been designed by someone with a doctorate in psychological warfare. "Next," called the bored Zentorian clerk behind window number 43, which looked exactly like windows 1 through 42, except for a small placard that read, "Exotic Wildlife Inquiries, Tuesdays Only." Lacey approached the window with the sort of forced optimism typically reserved for people about to negotiate with insurance companies. "I need information about 3 Kethrak cubs that were taken into custody this morning." The clerk, whose nameplate identified him as Zeltox, didn't bother looking up from his holographic display. "Species of inquirer. Human. Relationship to wildlife in question. I found them." Zeltox's head snapped up with the mechanical precision of someone whose day had just become infinitely more complicated. "You found them? As in, you were the reporting party?" "Yes." "Oh." Zeltox consulted his display again, then several other displays, then what appeared to be a physical book that looked older than Earth's recorded history. "I'm going to need you to fill out forms K9 through K18, provide a written statement of discovery circumstances, and submit a formal request for information access." He slid a stack of papers through the window that was roughly the thickness of a small phone book. Lacey stared at it with the expression of someone who'd just been handed a live grenade disguised as paperwork. "This is just to ask about their welfare?" "Standard procedure," Zeltox replied, already looking past her to the next person in line. "Processing time is typically 4 to 6 weeks, assuming all forms are completed correctly. Next." Lacey clutched the forms and stepped aside, watching as the next person, a Netherian with the sort of elegant composure that suggested they'd never encountered bureaucratic stupidity before, approached the window. She had a sinking feeling that by the time her paperwork was processed, the cubs would be long gone. She found an empty bench in the corridor and spread the forms out like a general planning a military campaign. Form K9 required her to provide a detailed account of her discovery, including time, location, weather conditions, apparently artificial atmosphere wasn't specific enough, and her emotional state during initial contact. Form K10 wanted to know her qualifications for identifying alien wildlife, her previous experience with predatory species, and whether she'd ever been treated for excessive empathy toward non-human entities. By Form K13, they were asking about her family medical history, her dietary preferences, and whether she'd ever had inappropriate emotional attachments to classroom pets. Form K15 required 3 character references from non-human sources, a requirement that seemed specifically designed to eliminate human applicants entirely. "This is insane," she muttered, loud enough that a passing maintenance worker, a cheerful-looking being with too many arms and what appeared to be natural camouflage, paused beside her bench. "First time dealing with station administration?" the worker asked in accented galactic standard. "Is it that obvious?" The look of existential despair gives it away. "I'm Krieg, by the way. Maintenance Division. What department is torturing you?" "Wildlife Management. I'm trying to check on 3 Kethrak cubs that were taken into custody this morning." Krieg's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy, if sympathy could be expressed through color-changing skin. "Ah, those cubs. Word's already gotten around maintenance. Blixen's got them in the high-security quarantine wing." "High security? They're babies." "Doesn't matter. Protocol is protocol, and Kethrak are classified as Class A, predators regardless of age. But—" Krieg glanced around, then leaned closer. "Between you and me, something doesn't smell right about this whole situation." "What do you mean?" "Cubs that age don't just get abandoned. Kethrak family groups are tighter than a Zentaurian's budget. For 3 cubs to end up alone on a space station, something bad happened to their pack." Lacey felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's climate control. "How bad?" "The kind of bad that makes cubs hide in maintenance shafts instead of calling for help. Kethrak don't abandon their young, but they might hide them if they knew danger was coming." Krieg's skin shifted to a darker pattern that Lacey was beginning to recognize as his species' equivalent of a frown. "There have been rumors. Ships going missing in the outer systems, crews vanishing. Official reports call it equipment failure, but maintenance workers hear things. We fix the ships that come back damaged." "Damaged how?" "Weapons fire. Boarding burns. The kind of damage you get when someone's hunting ships for their cargo." Krieg's skin went almost black. "Or their passengers." The implications hit Lacey like a physical blow. If Krieg was right, the cubs weren't just orphans. They were survivors. Their family hadn't abandoned them. They'd hidden them before whatever had destroyed their pack could find them. "I have to get to them," she said, standing up so quickly that the forms scattered across the floor. "Easy there," Krieg said, helping her gather the paperwork. "You can't just walk into high-security quarantine. Even if you could, Blixen's got the cubs scheduled for transfer first thing tomorrow morning." "Transfer where?" Krieg's silence was answer enough. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There are certain research facilities that pay very well for live specimens of rare predator species, especially young ones that can be trained." The forms crumpled in Lacey's hands. "They're going to sell them." "I didn't say that. Officially, they're being relocated to a specialized care facility, better equipped to handle their needs." "But unofficially?" "Unofficially, I'd suggest you work very quickly on those forms." Krieg's skin had gone completely black now. "And maybe consider alternative approaches to checking on their welfare." He melted back into the corridor traffic before Lacey could ask what he meant by alternative approaches. She stood there holding the crumpled forms, watching dozens of beings go about their daily business as if 3 innocent cubs weren't about to disappear into some nightmare research facility. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of increasingly desperate attempts to navigate the bureaucratic maze. The Wildlife Management Office told her that quarantine decisions were handled by station security. Station security informed her that custody transfers fell under the jurisdiction of the Legal Affairs Department. Legal Affairs explained that her inquiry would need to be processed through the proper channels, which led her right back to Wildlife Management and the cheerfully sadistic Zeltox. By the time the station's artificial evening cycle began, Lacey had spoken to exactly 19 different officials, filled out portions of 36 different forms, and been transferred between departments so many times that she was beginning to suspect the entire administrative system was an elaborate practical joke designed to break the spirits of anyone foolish enough to care about anything. She was sitting in the corridor outside the Legal Affairs Office, staring at Form K-15's request for character references, when she heard familiar voices approaching. Completely routine relocation, Blixen was saying to someone she couldn't see. The specimens will be much better cared for at the facility. And the human who found them? The second voice was smooth, cultured, with the sort of accent that suggested expensive education and expensive tastes. Minor inconvenience. She's been properly directed through channels. By the time her paperwork is processed, the matter will be resolved. They passed by without noticing Lacey, who had suddenly become very interested in appearing invisible. Blixen was walking alongside an elegantly dressed being she didn't recognize. Tall, bipedal, with the sort of bearing that suggested both wealth and the kind of moral flexibility that came with it. "The buyer will be pleased," the stranger continued. "Kethrak cubs of this age are exceptionally rare in the current market. The facility specializes in behavioral conditioning for exotic predators." Behavioral conditioning? Blixen's tone carried just a hint of unease. "Nothing inhumane, I assure you. Simply training them to be more manageable. There's quite a demand for domesticated apex predators among certain collectors." They disappeared around a corner, leaving Lacey sitting in the corridor with her hands clenched into fists and a growing understanding of exactly what kind of specialized care facility awaited the cubs. She'd heard enough corporate doublespeak in her life to know that behavioral conditioning and domesticated apex predators were euphemisms for something that would strip away everything that made the cubs who they were. She pulled out her communicator and tried calling the quarantine facility directly. After 20 minutes of automated menus and hold music that sounded like dying whales, she was transferred to a night shift supervisor who informed her that visiting hours were by appointment only. Appointments required approval from the supervising officer, and approval took 7 to 10 business days to process. "This is an emergency," Lacey said. "The cubs are being transferred tomorrow morning." "Then I suggest you work with your supervising officer to expedite the approval process," the supervisor replied, with the sort of professional indifference that suggested this conversation happened several times a day. "My supervising officer is the one who wants them transferred. I'm sorry, but I cannot override established protocols without proper authorization. Have a pleasant evening." The line went dead. Lacey stared at her communicator, feeling the walls of bureaucratic impossibility closing in around her. The cubs were trapped in a system designed to process them like cargo, and every official channel led back to the same dead ends and circular logic. She was still sitting in the corridor, contemplating the various ways she could express her frustration that wouldn't technically constitute destruction of station property, when her communicator chimed with an incoming message. It was from an anonymous sender, text only. "Maintenance shaft C12, level 9. 1 hour. Come alone." Lacey stared at the message, weighing the obvious stupidity of meeting an anonymous contact in a deserted part of the station against the rapidly diminishing alternatives for helping the cubs. The smart thing to do would be to ignore the message, go back to her quarters, and try to work within the system. But the system was designed to fail anyone without the right connections or the right species identification. And somewhere in the station's high-security quarantine, 3 scared cubs were spending what might be their last night of freedom, huddled together in sterile cages, waiting for morning to bring whatever fresh hell passed for a specialized care facility. She stood up, crumpled the remaining forms into a ball, and dropped them in the nearest waste disposal unit. If the system wouldn't help the cubs, she'd just have to find another way. After all, humans hadn't gotten this far in the galaxy by following the rules. Maintenance Shaft C-12 was exactly as advertised. Dark, cramped, and the sort of place where people met when they absolutely didn't want to be seen by security cameras. Lacey crawled through the access tunnel with all the grace of a caffeinated octopus, wondering if this was how her life was going to end. Not in some glorious interstellar adventure, but stuck in a ventilation shaft while trying to save alien predator cubs from bureaucratic nightmare fuel. The shaft opened into a junction chamber barely large enough for 2 people, lit by a single emergency strip that cast everything in sickly yellow light. Krieg was already there, along with someone Lacey didn't recognize, a compact, muscular being with scaled skin and the sort of scars that suggested a complicated relationship with sharp objects. "This is Lux," Krieg said without preamble. "He's got information you need to hear." Lux studied Lacey with eyes that seemed older than the station itself. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much and remembered all of it. "The cubs you found? They're not the first." "What do you mean?" 3 months ago, station records show a routine wildlife transfer of 2 young Kethrak. Before that, a family of Nexari cubs. Always the same pattern: found abandoned, processed through quarantine, transferred to specialized facilities. Lux's expression darkened. None of them ever made it to legitimate sanctuaries. Where did they go? Private collectors? Fighting rings? Some rich bastards who think owning apex predator pets makes them impressive? Lux leaned forward. Blixen's been running a side business, selling rescued wildlife to the highest bidder. The cubs you found are worth more than most beings make in a lifetime. Lacey felt sick. And everyone just lets this happen? Who's going to stop it? Krieg's skin shifted to frustrated purple. Official channels are compromised. Station administration turns a blind eye as long as the paperwork looks legitimate. And most species don't care enough about other species young to ask difficult questions. But you do. "We've been trying to gather evidence for months," Lux said. "The problem is, once the cubs are transferred, they disappear completely. We need proof of the illegal sales, documentation of the real destinations. Or," Krieg said quietly, "we need the cubs to not be available for transfer." The implication hung in the recycled air like a challenge. Lacey looked between them, understanding dawning with all the subtlety of a cargo ship collision. "You want me to break them out?" "We want you to consider all available options," Lux corrected diplomatically. "For instance, if the cubs were to somehow escape during the night shift change at 0300 hours, when the quarantine facility runs on minimal staff. And if someone were to accidentally leave certain access codes activated in the maintenance systems," Krieg added. "And if a concerned xenobiology student happened to be in the right place at the right time to ensure the cubs found their way to safety." Lux finished. Lacey stared at them. "You're asking me to commit breaking and entering, theft of secured specimens, and probably a dozen other felonies I can't even pronounce." "We're asking you to save 3 lives," Krieg said simply. Before Lacey could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Not the gentle chimes that announced shift changes or meal times, but the harsh, urgent sirens that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. All 3 of them froze, listening to the echoing wail. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the junction chamber in pulsing red that made everything look like a scene from a horror movie. "Attention, all station personnel," Blixen's voice crackled over the intercom system. "We have a code-red security breach in Quarantine Sector 5. 3 Class A predators have escaped containment. All civilians are advised to shelter in place immediately. Security teams are responding." Lacey's mouth fell open. "They escaped? How did they?" "Kethrak cubs are a lot smarter than most people give them credit for," Lux said, but his voice carried surprise, too. "Still, breaking out of high-security containment?" The intercom crackled again. "The escaped specimens are considered extremely dangerous. Do not approach. Do not attempt to assist. Report any sightings to security immediately." "Dangerous!" Krieg snorted, his skin flashing indignant orange. "They're babies looking for their human." "They're human?" Lacey repeated. "You fed them. You showed them kindness when they were scared and alone. In Kethrak's social structure, that makes you pack." Lux was already moving toward the shaft exit. "They're not running away. They're looking for you." The alarms got louder, joined by the sound of running footsteps and shouted orders echoing through the corridors. Security forces were mobilizing throughout the station, armed with containment fields and stun weapons, hunting 3 confused, frightened cubs whose only crime was trying to find the one person who'd shown them compassion. "I have to find them first," Lacey said, scrambling toward the access tunnel. "Wait!" Krieg called after her. "Where are you going?" "To my seat in the lecture hall," she called back, already crawling through the shaft. "If they're really looking for me, that's where they'll go. It's where I spend most of my time." She emerged from the maintenance system into corridors filled with chaos. Security teams rushed past, their equipment clanking and humming. Announcements echoed from every speaker, warning civilians to stay indoors while search teams swept the station sector by sector. But Lacey was already running, dodging between panicked students and confused faculty, heading for the one place in the entire station that felt like home. Because somewhere in these corridors, 3 small predators were hunting for their pack leader, and she'd be damned if she'd let them face this alone. The cubs had escaped on their own, but they were still babies. Scared, confused babies in a hostile environment filled with beings who saw them as monsters rather than children. They needed her now more than ever. And bureaucracy be damned. She was going to be there for them. The main lecture hall at 3 in the morning was a cathedral of shadows and silence, emergency lighting casting long red streaks across empty rows of seats. Lacey slipped through the side entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs as she made her way down the familiar aisles toward her usual spot. 3rd row, center seat, right where she'd been sitting when Professor Lux had first explained Kethrak's social hierarchies 6 weeks ago. It felt like a lifetime. She settled into her chair and waited, listening to the distant sounds of the search. Security teams moving through corridors, the static crackle of communicators, the occasional shout of "Clear!" echoing from other sectors. The cubs were out there somewhere, 3 small forms moving through a station that had suddenly become very hostile to their existence. The first sign she'd guessed correctly came as a soft scratching from the ventilation grate near the ceiling. Lacey looked up just as the grate fell away with a crash that seemed impossibly loud in the silent hall. 3 shapes dropped to the floor with the fluid grace that marked them as apex predators, even at 6 months old. They'd grown in the few hours since she'd seen them. Not physically. That was impossible. But there was something different in the way they moved, the way they held themselves. The scared, huddled cubs from the maintenance shaft had been replaced by focused, determined hunters who'd just completed the most daring jailbreak in station history. The smallest one, still sporting that distinctive white patch on its forehead, spotted her first. It made a soft chirping sound that was probably Kethrak for "found you," and bounded down the steps with the sort of joyful energy that suggested escaping from high-security quarantine had been the highlight of its evening. All three cubs converged on her seat, but instead of climbing on her or demanding attention like earth animals might have done, they arranged themselves in a perfect defensive triangle around her chair. The smallest took position at her feet, while the other two flanked her on either side, all of them facing outward with alert expressions that said they were ready for whatever came next. "Well," Lacey whispered, "this is new." She'd barely finished speaking when the lecture hall's main doors burst open and security forces poured in like a flood of armor and attitude. Blixen led the charge, flanked by a dozen officers with stun weapons and containment fields at the ready. They spread out across the hall with military precision, surrounding Lacey's position while maintaining what they clearly considered a safe distance from three dangerous predators. "Miss Knox!" Blixen called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Step away from the specimens immediately. They are extremely dangerous." Lacey looked down at the cubs. The smallest one had turned to look at her with those luminous amber eyes, its expression somehow managing to convey both, "Don't worry, we've got this," and "Please don't let the scary beings take us away again." The other two remained focused on the security forces, their postures alert but not aggressive, more like bodyguards than wild animals. "They're not dangerous," she called back. "They're protecting me." "Miss Knox, you don't understand Kethrak behavior." "Actually," a new voice interrupted from the upper entrance, "she understands it perfectly." Professor Lux descended the steps with the unhurried pace of someone who was accustomed to being the smartest person in the room and had the credentials to prove it. His appearance had the immediate effect of making the security forces look uncertain. Lux was old enough and respected enough that even Blixen couldn't simply order him around. "Professor," Blixen said, carefully, "this is a security situation. These creatures escaped containment and—" "These cubs," Lux corrected firmly, "initiated a pack bonding protocol with Miss Knox. What you're witnessing is not an escape. It's a homecoming." He approached the perimeter the security forces had established, and Lacey noticed that the cubs' posture shifted slightly. They remained protective of her, but their tension decreased in Lux's presence, as if they recognized him as non-threatening. "Kethrak's social structure is more complex than most species realize," Lux continued, addressing the room like a lecture hall full of students. "When cubs this age are orphaned, they don't simply become independent. They seek a new pack leader, someone who has shown them kindness, protection, and care. Miss Knox fed them when they were hungry, provided them with shelter, and called for help when she believed they were in danger. She violated station regulations by," Blixen began. "She followed her species' deeply ingrained caretaking instincts," Lux interrupted. "And in doing so, she accidentally triggered one of the most sacred bonds in Kethrak culture. These cubs have chosen her as their pack leader. They're not guarding her seat, they're guarding their territory." The smallest cub chose that moment to prove Lux's point by making a soft trilling sound and gently placing one paw on Lacey's foot. It was clearly a gesture of affection, but several security officers raised their weapons anyway. "Stand down," Lux said sharply. "You're looking at a family reunion, not a hostage situation." "Family reunion?" Blixen's voice cracked slightly. "Professor, with all due respect, these are dangerous predators." "These are children," Lacey said, finding her voice at last. "Children who lost their families and somehow survived long enough to find someone who cared about them. And you were going to sell them." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Several of the security officers exchanged glances, clearly hearing about the sale for the first time. Blixen's expression went through several rapid changes before settling on defensive anger. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Knox. The cubs were being transferred to a legitimate research facility." "Really?" Lux produced a datapad with the sort of flourish that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. "Because according to the financial records I've been reviewing, this legitimate research facility made some very interesting payments to certain station personnel. Payments that correspond remarkably well with previous wildlife transfers." Blixen's face went through several colors before settling on a pale green that suggested either illness or the dawning realization that his career was about to take a very unpleasant turn. "I don't know what you're implying, Professor, but—" "I'm not implying anything," Lux said pleasantly. "I'm stating, for the record, that you've been selling orphaned predator cubs to private collectors and fighting rings for the past 18 months. I have documentation of 12 separate transactions, all disguised as routine transfers to research facilities that don't actually exist." The lecture hall fell silent, except for the soft humming of containment fields and the quiet breathing of 3 cubs, who seemed to be following the conversation with remarkable intelligence. The smallest one had curled up against Lacey's feet like a cat, while the other 2 maintained their protective positions with the sort of patience that suggested they were prepared to wait as long as necessary. "Furthermore," Lux continued, "these cubs are survivors of a poaching attack on their family's ship. The massacre of an entire Kethrak family group is a war crime under galactic law, and selling the survivors makes you an accessory after the fact." "You can't prove any of that," Blixen said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can." Lux gestured toward the cubs. "These 3 remember what happened to their family. Kethrak have perfect recall from the age of 4 months. Once they learn to communicate with Miss Knox, and given their obvious bond that's only a matter of time, they'll be able to provide testimony about their family's attackers." Lacey looked down at the cubs with new understanding. They weren't just orphans. They were witnesses. They'd seen their family murdered, been hidden away before the attackers could find them, and survived alone until she'd stumbled across them. No wonder they'd bonded with her so completely. She was the first safe thing they'd encountered since their world had fallen apart. "So here's what's going to happen," Lux said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with bureaucratic nonsense and had finally run out of patience. "Miss Knox is going to apply for emergency guardianship of these cubs under the Interspecies Protection Act. The cubs are going to remain with her while the application is processed. And Chief Blixen is going to explain to Internal Affairs exactly how his department has been operating." "You can't just—" Blixen started. "I can, and I am." Lux smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I'm the senior xenobiology professor at this institution. These cubs are now part of an active research program, and Miss Knox is my research assistant. Any attempt to interfere with this arrangement will be met with formal complaints to both the Academic Council and the Galactic Ethics Commission." The cubs seemed to sense that the immediate danger had passed. The smallest one yawned, revealing those impressively sharp teeth, then settled more comfortably against Lacey's feet. The other 2 relaxed their guard positions slightly, though they remained alert and watchful. 6 months later, Lux would write in his final report, "The cubs have integrated remarkably well into station life. They attend classes with Miss Knox, have learned basic galactic standard, and show no signs of the behavioral conditioning that would have resulted from their intended fate. Miss Knox has become the first human to achieve full communication with Kethrak cubs, a breakthrough that has revolutionized our understanding of their social development. But that night, sitting in the lecture hall with 3 alien predator cubs arranged protectively around her chair, Lacey just smiled and gently scratched behind the smallest one's ears. Tomorrow there would be paperwork, interviews, and probably a dozen new regulations about human-Kethrak interactions. Tonight, though, she was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by her pack, in her territory, with her seat properly guarded by 3 of the most dedicated bodyguards in the galaxy, even if they were still small enough to curl up on her feet.